On January 6 at 8:36 p.m., Facebook announced that they have temporarily blocked President Donald Trump's Facebook account for 24 hours. 2 days later, on Friday, January 8th, Twitter permanently suspended Donald Trump's account in an event that critics called hilarious, the best thing that's ever happened, and just fantastic. And it only got funnier when multiple companies joined in on the ban and he kept trying to circumvent these bans in hilarious ways. Really, this whole event brought the entire internet together and really, warmed our hearts. Of course, the reasons for these bans were tragic. Months of misinformation and incitement by the president resulted in his followers storming the Capitol, some apparently with intent to capture or kill the president's enemies, many believing they were doing the president's will. This led to the deaths of 5 people, including one shot by Capitol Police and another police officer being beaten to death by the mob. On August 27, 2018, Facebook announced the ban of some 20 accounts of the Myanmar military, including their top general. These bans were put in place after the deaths of tens of thousands of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and the displacement of nearly 800,000. There's been a lot of talk from leftist content creators after the ban of Donald Trump about big tech and censorship in 1984, but I feel these discussions are limited by taking a specifically Western perspective. In the West, the death of 5 people from incitement can cause bans, but in the global South it takes orders of magnitude more, and the outcomes from inaction are far worse. Focusing solely on banning left or right-wing activists leaves out the more important questions about how we have ceded these decisions to corporations who only care about backlash when it comes from the West. There is a rightful conversation to have about free speech on the internet, but there's more here than whether or not one of the Search Times YouTube channels got banned once again. When it comes to free speech, most Western countries and many countries around the world have conceptions of what that means, but this conception is not universal. Limits to free speech vary from country to country, but even America, which has some of the most lax free speech laws, has some limits. Take this video from lawyer and most lawyer-looking person possible, Legal Eagle, where he talks about incitement as one of the limits to freedom of speech. Based on Brandenburg versus Ohio, incitement only counts where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. Which is to say, there has to be a one-to-one correlation from the speech to the violence taken. Historically, courts have been very careful with the application of this law, making it difficult for people in America to be charged with incitement. Other countries have more stringent limits on freedom of speech. Canada, my home country, as an example, has things like hate speech laws, which are constitutionally legal. One of the most infamous applications of this law was Keegstra v. Canada. In this case, a school teacher of a small Alberta town that he was also the mayor of started teaching anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in class. You know, the Jews were secretly controlling the world, Hitler was a cool guy, that sort of trash. And he also forced his students to recreate these answers on a test in order to, pass. He was eventually fired and charged under hate speech laws by the government. He took his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, where a narrow 4-3 decision upheld his criminal conviction. Wait, hold up. 4-3? I mean, this seems pretty clear-cut, right? Why was it such a close decision? Well, the dissenting opinion, written by Beverly McLaughlin, who would later become Chief Justice and is most well known for a series of aggressively Canadian controversies with former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, argued that the law itself was overly broad and didn't actually serve as an effective means to stop hate. Others, and I'm not going to name names because I read the article in a class like 3 years ago and I can't find the article anymore and the syllabus was lost to time, argued that the law was ineffective because there are other laws and structures to punish Keegstra outside of criminal conviction. So, for example, if the issue was him using his privilege as a teacher to foment odious ideologies, why not just fire him from being a teacher, as clearly he is not following the proper curriculum? That is to say, as a society, we have other means to stop hate speech that do not require government overreach or action, such as deplatforming them. Which leads us into the arguments about deplatforming, especially when it comes to controversial figures. And these arguments are clearly not new, and they're not new to Twitter or Facebook or social media more broadly. Free speech as a theory speaks specifically to government restriction, not to other restrictions that may occur. Take this XKDC comic because it sums it up just really well. But it's more complicated than that. So in the United States, they have this idea called the public forum, which is to say that on some, but not all, government properties, under certain circumstances, the government cannot restrict speech based on the speaker's opinion. There's different types of forums and stuff, but I'm not American or a legal scholar, and that's not really what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is that sometimes private property can be declared a public forum. In a number of contradictory Supreme Court cases, they bounce this idea back and forth, leading to the Pruneyard Shopping Center v. Robbins decision. To quote someone more knowledgeable on the subject than me, a state may, therefore, in the exercise of its power to regulate, adopt reasonable restrictions on private property, including granting greater freedom to individuals to use such property, so long as the restrictions do not amount to taking without just compensation or contravene any other federal constitutional provision. In this instance, it would be a taking of a property owner's right to exclude others. This is particularly narrow, usually involving political speech, and tends to be limited to malls or universities, and needs to be specifically designated by the state as a public forum. And so goes the argument. Should social media be declared and organized as a public forum? The easiest answer to this is, what? No, of course not. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily think it's as easy as all that. Given this pandemic seems to be dragging on for more than a year, a lot of speech, and especially political speech, happens on these platforms. Between Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and maybe LinkedIn if you don't actually want to get a job, politics is more and more often being discussed and debated on these platforms. Whether we like it or not, these companies host and maintain a lot of political speech. So while it is incredibly funny when Donald Trump gets kicked off social media, like it's just hilarious, it does kind of create a precedent with corporations banning speech they feel is unprofitable. The counter-argument is, they've always done that. YouTube will demonetize you for basically any reasons, and leftists are not unused to having their content yeeted for the slightest digression. Corporations have always silenced those who have been unprofitable. Only who and what gets the axe is not consistent. But even if we accept this has always happened, should we just allow corporations to control so much speech? Even if it is within their rights, should it be? Well, one argument could be that things like Twitter and Facebook can't be public forums because alternatives exist, and it's not like they're the only stage in town. There's still Parler and Gab, I guess, but what if that's not the case? What if the vast majority of a country only used one social media platform? What if that social media platform is so ubiquitous, it's used as a synonym for the internet itself? From all this, we have three main points. Free speech is generally a good thing. 2. Even if it's good, free speech has limits, and those limits vary from state to state. And 3. Corporations generally don't have to adhere to any rules about free speech, and can police their platforms as they see fit, except in rare circumstances. With all that being said, let's talk about Myanmar. Okay, just to start off, in 1989, the country changed its name from Burma to Myanmar. However, many countries around the world still refer to it as Burma despite the name change, so I kind of use both interchangeably depending on the context, and if that's confusing, fucking get over it. Most of you who are familiar with Myanmar either are aware of it due to the recent military coup, or due to this segment from John Oliver's weekly British Bake Off about Facebook, and we will touch on both those things, but first I want to set some important context. Myanmar was annexed as a British colony in 1886 as part of British India, before being modified into a separately administered colony. There were periodic agitations for independence up until World War II, where the country was invaded by the Japanese and was a major area of conflict throughout the war. The Burmese Independence Army was formed in Japan and helped them defeat the British in Myanmar, but then later turned against the Japanese and joined the Allies during the tail end of the war. This force was led by General Aung San, who became the premier of the country and helped secure its independence, although he would never live to see it, as he was assassinated before it was formally declared independent. Aung San is still a national hero in the country. He was succeeded by a number of other politicians until 1962, when the military staged a coup d'etat and set up a military junta. This was one of the longest running military juntas in modern history, which lasted until... oh, it's still going. Some people say it stopped being a military-led government in 2011, where after years and years of agitation and protest led by Aung San Suu Kyi, the only child of Aung San, they had their first election. However, the party that won was the Union Solidarity and Development Party, which was backed by the military. And additionally, they didn't allow Aung San Suu Kyi's party to actually run in that election. Beyond that, the 2008 Myanmar constitution that the military drafted has 25% of parliament reserved for members of the military, and the ministries of Home, Border Affairs, and Defense all had to be headed by a serving military officer. So even in 2015, when the National League for Democracy won, which was Aung San Suu Kyi's party, they were still hampered in certain areas. As Max Weber famously said, the defining characteristic of a state was having all them guns. So even when the military-backed government was no longer in power, the military still had all of the guns and could basically do with them whatever they wanted. So it's really no surprise that after their complete and utter failure in the 2020 elections, they administered a coup in 2021. They had the guns, and after all those years it was possible that their hegemony might finally actually be threatened. Myanmar didn't really transform into a democracy per se, it just more effectively hid the influence of the military right up until the point they feared that influence might actually be challenged. All of this leads us to Facebook, and I'm not going to reiterate all the points made by John Bon Jovi's Weekend Bonanza, just briefly mention some of the key points. Go watch that video if you want to learn more, or don't, whatever, I'm not your parent. He goes over a number of mistakes Facebook made, such as having only 4 moderators for a country of 50 million people, and not having the AI be capable of reading the Burmese script, and basically coming to the country without a fucking clue of what was going on. And most importantly, in my view, they created a virtual monopoly. When they introduced themselves into the country, Facebook came to an agreement with various telecom companies in the region where Facebook would come preloaded onto cell phones, and that the text-based forms of Facebook were free from data charges. What this meant was Facebook became the de facto platform on the Burmese internet. So much so, Facebook and internet are used interchangeably. This is one of the problems where you have a powerful corporation heading overseas and dominating a foreign market. Until 2010, there were heavy restrictions on the internet in Myanmar, which stifled communications and stifled communications companies from creating native-born platforms. As late as 2011, only 1% of people living in Myanmar had access to the internet, and so when a company like Facebook came over, there was no competitor. Who could challenge that monopoly? This is not to say the internet didn't exist before 2010, it did, however it was strictly controlled by the military government, and those websites that existed with a pro-democracy slant were cracked down on wherever possible. Under this environment of strict military control of information, while some internet activity existed in major cities, there was little in the way of large website companies, and certainly nothing that could challenge the size and power of Facebook. The government's harsh crackdown on internet usage prior to the rise of a nominally civilian government had serious consequences. Jonathan Bonathan talked about the fact that Facebook's algorithms did not work with the Burmese language font, and this was due to the harsh restrictions on internet usage, meaning the only Burmese language font that existed came from Burmese expats who had to create their own font, Zagwe. Zoggi? Whatever. Due to the way the Burmese written language works, it had to be hard-coded in certain ways that meant searching and filtering were not possible, breaking Facebook's content algorithm. If the country prior had more open access to the internet, this issue could have been solved sooner. And all of this speaks to an issue when you have a foreign company come to a country they don't understand the context of, and without that context they're not able to accurately or effectively monitor their platforms, because they didn't care to look into how that country worked, how their language worked, or how the society functioned. But the more pressing problem was how fast internet took hold. Prior to the sudden burst of internet usage through cell phone and Facebook, most Burmese people had never been on the internet. Almost all media they had for was state controlled, or the odd illegal magazine or radio broadcast near the border. There was no shared cultural understanding of fact checking. Imagine you lived your entire life not knowing what a Rickroll was, and then one day some troll from Macedonia sends you a link and this plays. React? You wouldn't even know what's happening. This is what happened, and what happened rapidly. The country's internet infrastructure exploded and spread, but at the same time, the most commonly used Zagwe font discouraged many internet companies from entering the market, leading to Facebook dominance. And what we have is a rapid and sudden monopoly on disinformation. And now, don't get me wrong, everybody is susceptible to disinformation. Yes, even you, viewer, and you are especially susceptible if you think you aren't. Take this video that spread around Twitter days after the January 6th riots. It's funny, right? Insurrectionists or whatever getting what's coming to them. You probably even saw this floating around your timeline. This video is actually from November 12th in 2020, and it had nothing to do with the Capitol riots. It was an anti-masker, I believe, but it's still not the same thing. And hey, maybe you knew that, and maybe you didn't, but a lot of people didn't, even people who hold internet literacy as part of their core personality traits. Now imagine the impact of the internet's disinformation campaign on a country completely unprepared to handle it responsibly. So the military and other power players were able to exploit this lack of knowledge with a massive disinformation campaign against the Rohingya. While the military may have done what it wanted to do no matter what, it wouldn't have enjoyed the same level of support, and misinformation through Facebook led to many riots that ended in many Muslims dead. Facebook did eventually ban certain members of the military and stepped up moderation efforts, but only years later after pressure from the West. Facebook, for its part, did not give a shit until groups in the West pointed out Facebook's negligence. It wasn't until the United Nations, who in a rare form was actually useful, released a report showing mass killings of Muslim Rohingya in what appeared to be an apparent attempt at genocide. Facebook wasn't acting benevolent when it censored some military leaders after these events. It was being reactionary, only acting when they think they might have been caught doing something bad, but usually they don't get caught. Had Facebook not forced its way into the country and forced out all competitors in the newly open internet, who knows what might have happened? In the days of internet censorship in Myanmar, there was a loose collection of blogs and sites that managed to stay up, and most likely this pattern would have continued without tech companies from other countries getting involved. What is clear, however, is that without Facebook, the type of disinformation campaign that was waged on the people of Myanmar would have been a lot more difficult or not possible at all. So let's cycle this back to the topic of free speech and what it means for Myanmar. Freedom of speech is not enshrined in the 2008 Constitution of Myanmar, which is no surprise considering its history. However, I think as a general rule we can agree it's preferable, especially in a state that used to have widespread suppression of speech and still does to a certain degree. But at the same time, free speech was abused in Myanmar to such an extent it caused atrocities and helped contribute to a genocide. Obviously, the government was never going to crack down on this particular speech, as it was beneficial to the government to perpetuate lies and misinformation, which left Facebook to decide what was and was not said. And in this case, a strong argument could have been made for Facebook being a public forum. It was the preeminent platform for discussing politics and incredibly ubiquitous. Ideally, in this situation, you'd have some form of generalized free speech, restricted by as few laws as possible, which was the case, only instead of laws, they were bound by a code of conduct, created, designed, and implemented by detached technocrats thousands of kilometers away. But the thing is that Facebook didn't care about free speech, it didn't care about a public forum, it didn't even really care about their own code of conduct. They were just out there to make a quick buck. Myanmar had 22 million Facebook users, impressive for a country of its size, but Facebook has 2 billion active accounts. After the coup, the military shut down Facebook in 2021, and time will tell if it'll be effective or if this coup will survive, but even if the coup is ultimately successful and decides to ban Facebook outright, do you know what will happen to Facebook? Like, what will change materially for the company Facebook? Fucking nothing! Nothing will change. They do not care. These issues of free speech are important, but they are papering over a more disturbing fact. We have ceded this entire conversation of free speech to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, and then exported our absence overseas in digital imperialism. There will never be a clear answer to the free speech question. Never. The limits of what does and does not count as acceptable speech will change depending on location and time. We should debate these limits, debate the boundaries, but we cannot cede the entire argument to, well, it's not technically a free speech issue, so I wash my hands of it, because this gives digital monopolies free rein to come up with inconsistent rules they barely can be asked to enforce. The idea that they are a free corporation, so it's not a free speech issue, is giving these companies free rein to ignore the issue of speech entirely until they get noticed. They are like a toddler you tell to clean their room, only doing so when you are actively watching them and throwing their toys all over the floor when you're not. This isn't the only time we see our exporting of technocrats doing real harm across the world. In Vietnam, Facebook and Google have taken down hundreds of posts and videos that the government has deemed harmful to the state. And whatever you think of Vietnam, you have to admit that censoring speech and these companies doing so is not, like, you know, a good thing. The Minister of Information and Communications noted that as of August 2019, Facebook had removed some 200 links on its platform to articles with anti-state content, and that the company was restricting access to increasing amounts of content on its platform. In particular, more than 70% of restricted requests from the government, up from the previous amount of approximately 30%. The New York Times reported on a story from India where posts on the Facebook messaging app WhatsApp caused at least one lynching, and in India, Facebook refused to censor hate speech from prominent BJP party members. These issues will continue to happen and are in many ways inevitable. No single company, no matter how large, is capable of effectively monitoring that many people in that many languages in that many countries, with all the intricate social and cultural issues that this implies. Whether we like it or not, digital communication is the future of political speech, and we should not cede control of this realm to giant corporations, giving them free rein to ransack the global south for money, while causing immeasurable harm due to their negligence. The very nature of social media and the internet more broadly has in many ways changed the scope of freedom of speech. We live in an age of instant communication, where if someone tweets some dumb shit at 6 AM, it'll be trending by 8 AM. And this is not wholly a bad thing, but it is a new thing, a different thing, and something we have not yet been able to reconcile with our conceptions of free speech. It's trite at this point to argue free speech is not freedom from consequences, that if you're the public face of a massive corporation, you might get fired if you, for example, just a random example, post anti-Semitic images and compare people making fun of you to the Jews during the Holocaust. But we do run into issues when speech results in the removal of speech. Like it or not, but the internet is getting smaller. There's fewer and fewer large websites, and those websites are getting larger and larger, eating more and more of the market share. I think most people agree that there is a limit to speech somewheres, but there's no consensus on where that line should be drawn. I'm going to take a wild guess here and say that most of my audience was fine with Donald Trump being removed from social media, if for nothing else in the fact that there's good evidence his tweets were direct incitement to try and kill Vice President Pence. And while I think Pence is both weird and bad, I think most people would agree it would have been a bad look if a mob of election truthers hung him outside the Capitol building. But what about QAnon more generally? Their conspiracy theory is straight up wild and dangerous. Watch Dan Olson's video if you want to know more. In the wake of the Jan 6 riots, QAnon was banned en masse, but does this mean all conspiracies should be banned, or only ones that might be violent? Or only ones that prove to be violent in some way? Where exactly is this line drawn, and who gets to draw it? Right now, the line is vague, and it's drawn by ultra-wealthy Silicon Valley tech billionaires. Sure, they'll ban right-wingers if there's enough pressure, but they'll also do whatever they can to hide stuff that's bad for the bottom line, which is often left-wing material. The Serfs, for example, seem to get banned or have a video taken down every other week, and they're not the only ones. Second Thought's video on the CIA wasn't banned per se, but it was age-gated, restricted, and oddly enough, you could not even find it if you typed in the exact name of the video into the YouTube search engine. Even in the United States, where heads of these companies can be dragged before congressional hearings, they're free to do with their platforms as they wish, promote who they want, ban who they want, with what is essentially no oversight. Even if you think some of these bans are good, them being good or bad are incidental to their purpose of making money. And that's in a country with some ability to hold them to account. Do you think Mark Zuckerberg would ever allow himself to be brought to a hearing held by Aung San Suu Kyi or Ming Aung Hlaing? Of course not. It is in the nature of capitalism to expand. It is in the nature of corporations to eat up their competitors. There is no monopoly on social media, but it's getting closer and closer every day, and these massive corporations will eat alive any competitors that could be organically grown in developing nations. Michael Quet outlines some of the many problems with digital colonialism in his aptly named paper, Digital Colonialism, US Empire and New Imperialism in the Global South. There's no reason to assume Northern technology will benefit the Global South. Questions such as, are cloud centers built by Amazon, Microsoft, or Google good for the country? Or, which technologies best promote privacy rights, transparency, collaboration, and local development are entirely absent from the public discourse. He outlines the various ways these companies are able to abuse the countries they go to and suck all the profits overseas. These massive monopolies going overseas and using their wealth and ability to suck up risk, dominate these markets, and thereby destroy the ability for these countries to create their own technological structures. There is no reason to think that the technological infrastructure systems that have been developed in the West are the most effective or efficient ways of creating technology. Different cultures might come up with different ways of conceiving technology and how to build these technological platforms. The assumption that the Western products and models are beneficial to everyone, so long as they are tamed by regulation, is unsupported. Treating big data, cloud centralization, and proprietary software as apolitical or unstoppable normalizes them and removes practical alternatives from consideration. These are holistic and multifaceted problems, but all come down to the way foreign powers have used their money and resources to drown out companies on the ground. Beyond that, they are not held accountable by the people in those places. They are perhaps slightly responsible to some governments insofar as they'll agree to block certain things that usually go against the current government's opinion or status quo, but in terms of systemic changes that challenge their hegemony, they have all the power in this relationship. The effect these companies have on technology and speech is frankly chilling. By limiting the scope of potential technologies, by buying out markets that are still in their infancy, and their hands-off, unresponsive approach to moderation guidelines and general management, they create systems that are catastrophic to these countries. But of course, these corporations don't care. What they want is the money they can extract. So we've talked about a lot of things in this video, so let me break down some of the main points. Free speech in general is a good thing. Despite being broadly good, free speech has limits in different places and times. Corporations are generally not required to follow free speech laws, but this too is not universal. We generally accept that corporations should restrict some speech. However, the nebulous rules in poor enforcement is generally a bad thing and should be better regulated. Corporations don't give a shit about third world countries. They just exploit them for money. Consequently, their approach to speech on their platforms is completely haphazard, leading to problems worldwide and only stops when there's outside pressure. And finally, this is all just really dark shit. I don't have all of the solutions, but I feel when we talk about big tech, from a Western perspective, we are missing the true insidious nature of these corporations. Like always, they'll fuck us over, but they prefer to get rich off the backs of people in places with less clout. And we can't have a true and honest conversation about free speech, the internet, and big tech without discussing these effects. As a whole, I think these industries need to step back from these countries to allow their own media landscapes to flourish, and I proudly agree with Michael Quet's position that he lays out in his Al Jazeera article that tech that is free and open source, interoperable, and decentralized can be built so that no institution anywhere in the world could own or control it as one of the solutions, and I do recommend reading that article linked below. I hope, if nothing else, this video has caused you to think more about these issues. I used Myanmar as an example because it shows the different ways free speech affects a country in a social media environment where it would not affect us here in the West as much, and how we need to think about the impacts of exporting these massive technologies and social media outlets to these countries. I'm not qualified to answer all of the complicated issues that I have raised in this video, but there is a discussion here that I think needs to be had about questions of rights, jurisdiction, technology that probably isn't, at least not in the West. I hope you enjoyed the video. I've got nothing. Like, comment, and subscribe for more depressing shit.